First, it's been brought to my attention that I'm sure there were more errors and slips of dates, but I made one mistake when I talked about the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 under the Adams administration. That was actually under the Washington administration, since Adams didn't take office until 1796. So with that little proviso, we left with the Civil War. Now, there's several ways we can proceed from here into the so-called progressive era. I will be emphasizing, perhaps more than before, at least in the last lecture, intellectual history or certain intellectual trends that lead into what Americans generally call the progressive era. Now, the progressive era is dated differently depending on whom you read, and like all categories in human history, the dates are arbitrary. Some historians will date progressivism from, say, 1900 to 1915. Some will date it 1890 to 1915. For my own purposes, I tend to see the rise of progressivism emerging out of this Whig pietism that I discussed before, this kind of self-righteous moral crusade, and I'll be discussing this more, how this evolves. So I'll be actually tracing the rise of progressivism in that sense to the post-Civil War period and even a little before. The seeds of progressivism were there. Now, what can we say about the Civil War before we leave it? Well, in terms of its economic impact, the Civil War was very, very important. I won't run through all of the legislation that was passed by the Republican legislature while the Democrats were away, so to speak, but any standard textbook will run through a long litany of laws that were passed. The National Banking Act, there were legal tender laws passed, there were various high tariffs imposed, taxes imposed. Some of these were repealed after the war, many were not. And most importantly, even those that repealed set a precedent for later legislation. So certainly the Republican Party, which at this time obviously embodied the mid-19th century version of the Hamiltonian ideal, with the Southern Democrats out of the way, they had a free rein to get these measures through, which they never would have gotten through with the Southern, more Jeffersonian opposition. So the Civil War is a watershed in domestic legislation in that respect, at least, that many of these domestic laws were passed, the moral tariff and so forth, during that period in American history, during the Civil War period. Now, I want to go back to this issue of the Jeffersonian ideal and the Hamiltonian ideal, again, as models, because this is a good way to express what's going on here. Now, remember what we talked about the two models were. Remember how we discussed them. Jefferson basically stood for, even if he wasn't always consistent, individual rights, free exchange, free markets, non-interventionism abroad, the whole system of ideas that we today would associate with, say, limited government libertarianism or classical liberalism. Hamilton, on the other hand, wanted strong central government, energetic government, as he called it. He wanted a close alliance between big business, as we would call it today, and government. He wanted central banking. He wanted high tariffs. He wanted that whole group of ideas we associate today with actually both parties, but basically the very heavily statist side. Now, these are two ideals that filter their way throughout the 19th century, and one way of judging the effects intellectually of something like the Civil War is to find out what happened to these two ideals, because the break is really quite dramatic. Prior to the Civil War, Jefferson, in name at least, was more or less considered to be the model. The Democratic Party was considered to be the party of Jefferson. Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren were admirers of Jefferson. They claimed to be his intellectual heirs. The Whig Party even, to some extent, wanted to claim Jefferson as their ideal, although with less plausibility. Jefferson was the person you appealed to. Alexander Hamilton is rarely heard of. There were no biographies of him written. His papers were not really available. He was not liked because he stood for everything that Americans before the Civil War were supposed to oppose. Now, the South had a problem. Jefferson was their man. He was a Virginian. He was pro-states' rights. Jefferson should have been very appealing to Southerners, and he was to many. But there were several problems with Jefferson as the abolitionist movement began to develop. In the 1830s, with the rise of William Lloyd Garrison and abolitionism, the Declaration of Independence was constantly appealed to as a case against slavery. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, etc., etc. The Southerners recognized, the more avid pro-slavery advocates recognized the dangerous implications of this Jeffersonian philosophy for slavery. Consequently, starting in the 1830s, there's a certain shift in much of the pro-slavery writing away from the social individualism of Thomas Jefferson to a more organicist theory, or more social, like the society is a social organism. There were various rather feeble attempts to explain away Jefferson's comments in the Declaration of Independence. And now you have to understand the slave owners in the South were a minority among the Southern people, so when I say Southern, I'm not trying to stereotype here. I'm talking about the avid defenders of slavery who came out and actually defended it as an institution. Jefferson himself, although a slaveholder, was virulently opposed to slavery. He called it a moral evil. He called for its abolition. One of the problems he had was in his time, the manumission or the liberating of slaves was illegal. You needed special permission from the Virginia legislature to do it. This was the case throughout most of the South. While in the Virginia legislature, he tried to legalize manumission. He was not an abolitionist, however. He was a gradualist. He wanted the gradual eradication of slavery, and also, against Jefferson, he was a colonizationist. Like many of the gradualists were, he wanted the former slaves and even the free blacks to be sent off to another country somewhere, so they would not intermix with American society. In his famous phrase, "We have a wolf by the ears. We can neither let him go, we cannot continue to hold on to him. Justice is in one scale, expediency is in the other." He thought that there'd be great social upheaval if the African slaves were released into American society, even though many of them had been born in America and had been raised there. So Jefferson could be used by both sides of the slavery controversy. He clearly had a certain racial theory of the inferiority of blacks, which comes out in his writing, although he was not a virulent racist, and he didn't seem to think it had any particular political implications. And he was an opponent of slavery, so he could be used by both the apologists of slavery and the opponents, depending on which part of his writing you quoted. But you do see the decay of the Jeffersonian ideal starting in the 1830s as the abolitionists start to take up the Jeffersonian cry of equal rights. Now, a really excellent book on this is Merrill D. Peterson's book, considered a really superb work in American intellectual history, called The Jefferson Image in the American Mind. I won't write that down there. The Jefferson Image in the American Mind. And in fact, what Peterson does in this book, a very good Jeffersonian scholar, is trace the image of Jefferson, the ideals he held, and how they were transmitted throughout American history, even through the 20th century. He also discusses the contrasting model of Alexander Hamilton. Now, that's where I'm getting a lot of the material I'm giving you about the two contrasting ideals. Peterson points out that with the Civil War, the Jeffersonian model was basically destroyed because the Jeffersonian model was one of contractarianism, of government being based on consent. It implied the right of revolution, which is actually the right of secession. What was the American Revolution except the secession of the American colonies from the mother country? That's what right of revolution really means. The Union philosophers, the Northern philosophers, during and after the Civil War, recognized clearly the radical implications of Jeffersonian social contract theory, and Jefferson was attacked, vilified as being the fomenter of revolution, being in a sense philosophically responsible for the Civil War. It's interesting, as Peterson points out, to find that Hamilton is not mentioned at all virtually before the Civil War. During the Civil War and right after, suddenly there's this great resurgence of interest in Alexander Hamilton. I mean, tremendous resurgence of interest. He is now considered the great nation builder, is what they begin to call him. There are novels written about him. There are books written, biographies written about him. As one George W. Curtis, a rather influential intellectual of the time, said, "Have you thought what a vindication this war is of Alexander Hamilton?" Close quote. This is the sort of rhetoric that was used by the Northerners after their victory, that they said that Hamilton was right, you needed a strong, energetic central government, you particularly needed it because it would prevent future secession. And it had been the principles of Thomas Jefferson which in fact had led to the Civil War. Now, let me give you another example of what begins to happen here. At the end of the Civil War, intellectually, as I said, the ideal of the social contract is dead, really, among Northern philosophers, except relatively few. You have the rise of this intense nationalism, that kind of "mine eyes have seen the glory" type of music. It's in the art. Wartime usually brings about this sort of nationalistic culture, wartime culture, but rarely have we seen it with such intensity as we saw it after the Civil War. There reemerges this pietistic Whig culture, the emphasis on moral values, making good, having good moral sound people, and this is why the state schooling system, which I'll be dealing with, really the real push for that and compulsory attendance laws occurs not too long after the Civil War. It was explicitly intended as a measure to make sure this sort of secession and disloyalty never occurred again. You get a kind of mystical exaltation of the nation state in America after the Civil War, the kind of the mystical union of the people. It's interesting, as Peterson points out, that after the Civil War, the United States of America is no longer considered to be a plural noun. It is treated as a singular noun. We'd say the United States are, it turned to the United States is. That's simply one kind of interesting indication of the change in attitude. Let me give you an example of another quote he gives from James Russell Lowell. He said, Americans had not known, quoting Lowell, that unconscious feeling of nationality, the ideal abstract of history and tradition, which belongs to older countries, compacted by frequent war and united by memories of common danger and common triumph. This man continues, but what splendid possibilities has not our child revealed even to ourselves, close quote. You have in people who had been through tremendous upheaval on both sides, and there was this resorting to this kind of mystical nationalism. Contractarianism is out the window. To make things worse, towards the end of the 19th century, many of the leading American intellectuals, sociologists, philosophers go to study in German universities. They come back thoroughly imbibed with the ideas, particularly the influence of Hegel in German universities, who held also this very mystical view of the nation, the submersion of the individual into the greater good, the greater nation state. This really marks the rise, the dramatic rise of nationalism in America. Nationalism in the bad sense. I don't mean being proud of your country, proud of its ideals. I mean this kind of single-minded nationalism that will destroy anything in its path. That's the kind of nationalism I'm talking about, militant nationalism. So here you have, in Peterson's book, outlined the very clear intellectual shifts that begin to take place. He gives an interesting example of how let me go back to the Southern case, for example, and how the change in the South about the Jeffersonian ideal. He gives an interesting example of the first novel written by an American Negro called Clotel. It's an interesting novel because it was alleged, the story begins, now you all know the story that Jefferson was reputed to have had sexual relations with his female slaves, one in particular, Sally, and was alleged to have had a number of illegitimate mulatto children. Now this story was originally spread by the Federalists as a means of smearing Jefferson. It was then picked up on, particularly after the Civil War, and even before actually, by blacks themselves as a source of pride. And there were a number of slaves and former slaves who claimed to be, in fact, the descendants of Thomas Jefferson. Now, it's difficult for historians to piece this together, but this is where the story comes from. The American blacks saying that they remembered their grandmother talking about Thomas Jefferson and having lived with him and having called him granddad and this sort of thing. These sorts of oral traditions were passed down. Now, we don't know whether the story is true or not. I suspect it probably has some truth to it. But nonetheless, this novel begins really with the story of the daughter of Thomas Jefferson being sold at a slave auction. Rather dramatic point. Here you have a black daughter of Thomas Jefferson, and she's being sold at a slave auction. A very interesting book. But the point I'm going to make here is that at one point in this, it's a fictionalized account, there is a slave participating in Nat Turner's rebellion. Remember that I talked about before? And he's being tried for his life. He's eventually hanged. And here's what he says in his trial, in his own defense. Quote, I will tell you why I joined the revolting Negroes. I have heard my master read in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and this caused me to inquire why I was a slave, close quote. Well, as I said, the Southern slave defenders began to get the light here that this was not something that was too congenial to the defense of slavery. But if you want to look into this, it's a fascinating debate about the Jeffersonian versus the Hamiltonian ideal. The point I'm making here is the Civil War marks definitely the victorious emergence of the Hamiltonian ideal in American politics. I mean, explicitly so, and this is what I have to emphasize. It's not that I'm reading this into it. These people dropped Jefferson like a hot potato and picked up Hamilton. There's a whole series of histories written. You know, Henry Cabot Lodge and these people wrote a number of histories. Suddenly Hamilton and the Federalists come out looking like great guys. And if you've ever read any of this late 19th century American history, it's almost always anti-Jefferson and pro-Hamilton. Anti-Democratic Party, pro-Federalist Party. And this is the reason. It's very closely tied to the Civil War. So I don't know what better way we could get a sense intellectually of what the Civil War did to American thinking and American images of what their heritage was. Considering even that one quotation I gave you previously from Alexander Hamilton, the idea that this man would somehow then become the American ideal is a rather chilling prospect. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit, talk a bit more about this Whig pietism, as I called it, and that's the name generally used by historians. Now, remember I said the Whig Party was formed in the 1830s, came out of New England, particularly Massachusetts, and also came out of western and upstate New York, the so-called burned-over district in New York, which was so-called because of the various evangelical movements that rushed through like a fire, using the metaphor of burning it over. They had burned over this district. Have you heard that expression, the burned-over district? I don't know if you have, that's where it came from. This Whig pietism begins to spread. As I said, it was the good thing about it was the real motive for the abolitionist movement. So that we'll give it a plus there. A lot of the abolitionists did come out of this Whig pietistic tradition, such as William Lloyd Garrison. Unfortunately, all the other social reform movements came out of it. Temperance reform and all the other things I listed. Sabbatarian reform. A good example, and this will get me into this, and I'm going to be talking about education quite a bit from now on as an example of the points I'm making. I'm doing this for an obvious reason. It gives us a unifying theme, but also I spent 3 years researching a book on the subject, so it's a subject I'm quite familiar with. Education, the issue of state education becomes extremely important. I don't wish to make this a talk on education because it's not. I'm simply using the examples of education to illustrate the general trends that begin to emerge here. Now, those of you in education or who've studied the history of education must have heard of this man, Horace Mann, M-A-N-N. This man is called the father of the common school system in America. He's still revered by the NEA and whoever else that likes the state school system we have. Horace Mann, if we were looking for an individual who exemplified the pietistic Whig tradition in all of its ugly aspects, it would be difficult to find someone better to illustrate it than Horace Mann. Horace Mann was born in Massachusetts. He entered the state legislature where he fought vigorously on behalf of the railroads to get them to the large cities, claiming that what benefited the large cities benefited everyone. He was basically your high tariff, high tax man type. But the interesting thing about Mann is although he started out as a Calvinist, like many of these pietistic Whigs did, a Calvinist in his youth, he soon became a Unitarian under the influence of William Ellery Channing. You know what Unitarianism is? It's kind of a watered-down Christianity. Not very doctrinal or dogmatic in its beliefs. But nevertheless, Unitarianism in America during this period of time still had this pietistic zeal about it. A lot of these reformers were not born-again Christian types, but they came from that background, and they never lost their Calvinist zeal for social reform. Now, let me give you an example of how Mann dealt with issues as a legislator in the Massachusetts legislature when he was there, long before he got interested in education. What was his big crusade before it was education? His big crusade was temperance reform. He wanted to get rid of liquor. And it's interesting, if you look at what he says about temperance reform, he makes the same claims for it that he later makes for education. In other words, on the education issue, he says, if only we had common schools, everything in America would be wonderful, crime would be gone. He lists this whole string of things like all these common school reformers did that would allegedly occur in America with the common school system. He says essentially the same about the issue of prohibition. Listen to some of this. He said, he insisted it was necessary to put the grog shops out of business completely, quote, to maintain order and morality and secure the safety of the people. He explained to a friend of his that his goal in temperance reform was, quote, the entire prohibition of the sale of ardent spirits as a drink, the abrogation of the laws authorizing the existence of public places for its sale or use. Now, listen to this comment he puts in another letter. I have sometimes felt, and this summarizes very well this pietistic Whig tradition, I have sometimes felt, he said to a friend, as if I had a right, in the sacred name of humanity, to call upon everyone to contribute his assistance in so beneficent a work. He's talking about prohibiting liquor. He was indeed, as a close friend described him, the champion of sobriety and public virtue. Now, let me give you an example of how weird this gets. Horace Mann also pushed for Sabbatarian laws. That is, he wanted activity severely curtailed on Sunday. Now, I mentioned that he was a Unitarian, so he did not hold any particular biblical views about the Sabbath. So why did he want Sabbatarian laws? This is an interesting case of how the religious becomes the secular, how this social Whig pietism takes on a secular form, a secular garb, if you will. His reasoning here is very, very significant in his argument for Sabbatarian laws. He says, quote, "I do not believe the Sabbath is any more holy time than any other day of the week, but I believe that as a social and political institution, it is invaluable." Close quote. What did he mean? Well, one thing he meant was the problem of the immigrants. In other words, he wanted to restrict certain activities on Sunday as a way of keeping the population, just kind of letting them know who's boss, as a form of discipline. This idea of social discipline and order becomes very important. Now, we're talking about the 1830s here. You can see the sort of mentality I'm talking about. You can't just look at this common school movement and all this and not understand the general outlook of these people. They were very arrogant, pietistic Whig types who thought they were out to save the world. Later, they turned into ardent imperialists and want not just save the United States, but literally save the entire world. I'll be giving you some examples of that. But ask yourself this question. The real push for public schools, or what were then known as common schools in America, comes during the 1840s. What else was happening during the 1840s? Anyone have a guess here? That's significant in this regard. Exactly. The Irish potato famine. Thousands and thousands of Irish are coming over to America. Okay? Now, what were the two major places these Irish ended up going? The two major cities? Boston and New York, right? Were the two of the major cities. Where do you think two of the biggest pushes for the common school systems were? Boston and New York. Now, we might say that's a great coincidence. Well, we might say that, but obviously it's not a coincidence. And I will give you an example of just one of many, believe me, I could give you like this, to show you exactly how blunt these pietistic Whigs and everyone, I mean, believe me, to a man, the common school reformers were these pietistic Whig types. How much, you might think they were very tolerant, they wanted to educate the poor kids. Believe me, friends, this is not the argument that was used. They knew the private school systems were doing a reasonably good job of making kids literate. That was not the subject. This business you hear today about the school system needed to educate poor kids, those are all after-the-fact sort of rationalizations. Those were not the arguments used at that time. The arguments used at that time had to do with the problem of social diversity, the problems of social conflict, which were caused by the mass influx at first of the Irish immigrants who had the double sin of being at once Irish and at once Catholic. Now, it was bad to be Irish because, remember, these guys are New England Whig types, and they're very pro-English. You can imagine the effect. If you're a poor Irish family, you come over, save your pennies, get over to Boston, find that your child is required to attend a so-called common school, which at that time was a Protestant school. They read from the Protestant Bible. They read Protestant histories. You send your little kid off to the Protestant school, and what does he learn? He learns throughout his text that the Pope is the Antichrist, a phrase that constantly recurs throughout the textbooks of the time. He learns how wonderful Oliver Cromwell was, the man who killed and massacred thousands of your ancestors. He learns that the Irish were a barbaric race. He learns all these things, and you're not too thrilled about this. So what do? You start setting up your own parochial school system because you're not going to have your children taught these Protestant, virulently anti-Catholic values. Well, the Protestants weren't going to put up with this either. They wanted these kids forced into these schools, and they said so. Consider this very typical passage from a very important educational journal from 1850 called the Massachusetts Teacher, referring to the problem of Irish and Catholic immigration. This, by the way, the term that was used oftentimes, we must Americanize the immigrants. They also use the term, we must Christianize the Catholics. Here is the great, one of the typical things, and this is not unusual, believe me. Here's one of the typical passages from the literature of this time from Massachusetts. With the old, and we're talking about Irish Catholics, with the old, not much can be done. But with their children, the great remedy is education. The rising generation must be taught as our children are taught. We say must be because in many cases this can only be accomplished by coercion. Now, no, you don't have to read between the lines here, right? This is why I read this directly. If I said it was this blunt, you probably wouldn't believe me. You say, no one would be stupid enough to put it that clearly. In too many instances, the parents, again, Irish Catholic parents, are unfit guardians of their own children. If left to their direction, the young will be brought up in idle, dissolute, vagrant habits, which will make them worse members of society than their parents are. Instead of filling our public schools, they will find their way into our prisons, houses of correction, and almshouses. Now, it gets worse here. Nothing, now we're talking about the great public school system here, folks. This is, remember, this is not jails we're supposed to be talking about, it's public schools. Nothing can operate effectually here but stringent legislation thoroughly carried out by an efficient police. The children must be gathered up and forced into school. And those who resist or impede this plan, whether parents or priests, with priests italicized, must be held accountable and punished. Close quote. Well, QED, I mean, that becomes the major argument, all right? Now, there are other factors operating which merge with this Whig pietism. This is Whig pietism at its worst, rather typical, but at its worst. There are other things that emerged during the same time that I should mention. The intense nationalism caused by the Civil War also added impetus to this movement, not only for unity of values in society at large, but all kinds of social reform movements. The common school movement was so critical because the idea was you had to get these kids early. As that passage said, you can't do much with their parents, but if we get them early, we're going to construct the virtuous, pietistic Whig America. You ever heard the term the melting pot, the great melting pot? That was a pietistic Whig idea. Perhaps a better phrase would be a blast furnace. Because, but here you see the importance of the idea of spontaneous order. Because what was the Jeffersonian ideal? What was this ideal of competition? It wasn't just economic competition, it was also competition in lifestyles. The idea that lifestyles, religion should be allowed to flourish, compete with one another, and win over whomever they can. That was anathema to these pietistic Whigs who thought it would destroy the social fabric, who had no real conception of spontaneous order, that is an unplanned order, and therefore demanded that the state impose a uniform system of values on the children at an early age, and thereby preventing all kinds of dissension, particularly another civil war. Now let me show you how the nationalism, again just one example of many that I could give, how the nationalism works its way into this argument. The most important California educator of this period was a man named John Swett, S-W-E-T-T. At least some of these people have repulsive names. Swett was the California State Superintendent of Public Instruction in 1862. He was a former superintendent of schools in San Francisco as well. He campaigned during the Civil War in California for the state superintendency. And the major plank of his campaign was that he was a union man, as he called it, in every fiber of his body. And as the state superintendent of schools, he promised to make California, quote, union to the backbone, close quote. He went on to say that the common schools were what he called the great nurseries of patriotism. And he said, "Cast your eye over the map of our country today and show me a section of states from which men shed their blood most freely in battle for the defense of the Union, and I will show you that such states have also expended the most money for public schools." The crowning achievement, in Swett's words, of the public school system, quote, is that they have educated an army of 500,000 of men who have volunteered to sustain the national flag with the bayonet. He concluded, "In this great national crisis, let us consecrate ourselves anew to our work in educating the boys and girls that shall preserve this government from future disunion and secession," close quote. Now, that sentiment could be repeated ad nauseum, believe me. That is not an isolated case. The Civil War and this passionate cry for nationalism had much to do with the rise of this common school movement and these other types of social institutions, this institutionalization, as historians call it, that begins to take place. Now, as a way to show how this, what I'm arguing here is basically something many historians would probably not agree with. I'm suggesting that what we know as progressivism, what we associate with philosophers like John Dewey in political theory, what we associate with Theodore Roosevelt as president in the early 1900s in America, that type of philosophy really is, the germs of it are already here. It comes out of this pietistic Whig movement. It simply takes on different forms throughout American history. It's kind of a Hamiltonian system combined with kind of an evangelical zeal, a strange amalgam of different traditions. Let me show you how, in regard to public schools, this kind of wording. See, the thing here that I'm sure you'll appreciate, it's not, what is scary about these passages is not what they're saying, in effect, that we want schools. What's scary is how they're saying them, the type of language, the type of presumption that just reeks from these passages. Let me give you two examples from around the turn of the century now. So I'm moving up to what most historians would consider to be the progressive era. And keep in mind the quotes I've already given you from Horace Mann and others, and notice the similarity. If anything, though, these progressive sociologists are even more blunt in their call for the role of state education. The first is from Charles Cooley. These are both very important early American sociologists. Charles Cooley had this to say about the possibilities of state education in America. Since the school environment is comparatively easy to control, here is the place to create an ideal formative group or system of groups which shall envelop the individual and mold his growth. A model society by assimilation to which he may become fit to leaven the rest of his life. Here, if anywhere, we can ensure his learning, loyalty, discipline, service, personal address, and democratic cooperation. Now, I find that kind of an Orwellian chill goes up my backbone. Democratic cooperation, finishing off the list of service, personal address, etc. Now, you think that's bad. Here's another prominent, even more prominent sociologist, taught at Stanford, a great hero to Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt just loved this fellow. I think they finally fired him from Stanford. He got so outrageous. But here's what a very important sociologist named Edward Ross had to say about the same subject. Again, it's not the fact that's on the public school system that's important. It's the mindset of these people in the progressive era, which shows how they were, in effect, the heirs of this pietistic Whig culture. This kind of this great arrogance and feeling that they are the experts. They are the not only experts, but they are the kind of the guardians of morality. And it's this kind of strange combination of feeling that they're experts and the sciences, and yet are also the great guardians of moral virtue. And it's this weird merger of the idea of moral virtue with expertise that really characterizes the great two components, in my view, philosophically, of what's known as the progressive movement. Now listen to how Edward Ross, a very well-respected sociologist in his day, puts it. To collect little plastic lumps of human dough from private households and shape them on the social kneading board exhibits a faith in the power of suggestion which few people ever attain to. Ross concludes, and so it happens that the role of the schoolmaster is just beginning. Now, again, these are not by any means unusual quotes. I find the Ross quote almost amazing even in view of the others because it's hard to believe that you'd even press it that far. I'm going to, although I'm skipping around in terms of time, since I'm on this by one of my favorite people, since Ralph's here to listen to, I always... Don't take this personally, Ralph. You know, this happens every conference. Okay. Ross had a kind of a, what you might call well, he was a bit of a racist, let's say, okay? He didn't like anyone who wasn't American, you know, is what it came down to. But he was also a social scientist, okay? So he undoubtedly did some kind of great scientific study of all the immigrant stocks that were coming over to America. He published his conclusions in around 1900 in a magazine which at that time was like the equivalent of Look or Life, something like that, called the Century Magazine. Rather well-known, widely circulated magazine. Now, you have to understand what we're talking about here. We're not talking about some right-wing crazy publication with kind of a red cross on it that you get in the mail and talks about patriots, right? You wonder what mailing list you're on. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a respected professor of sociology at Stanford, revered by the President of the United States, publishing in a major magazine. Now, Ross doesn't have his statistics. I'm sure he must have done great statistical research to reach these conclusions. Ross doesn't have his statistics in the Century Magazine, so presumably, maybe they're in his paper somewhere, maybe he published them in a scholarly journal of sociology. But listen to his great breakdown of the various immigrant stocks that had been coming into America. Now, the picture of immigration had changed in the late 1800s, particularly in the 1880s. It had become not so much Irish as Eastern European, Slavs, Poles, and so forth, particularly Russian Jews, things like this. So he goes through a list of these immigrants and gives his various scientific judgments on these people. All right. He begins by saying that, quote, the blood now being injected into the veins of our people is subcommon. He continues, it is reasonable to expect an early falling off of the frequency of good looks in the American people. It is unthinkable that so many persons with crooked faces, coarse mouths, bad noses, heavy jaws, and low foreheads can mingle their heredity with ours without making personal beauty yet much more rare among us than it actually is. So much ugliness, he concludes, is at last bound to work to the surface. Close quote. Now, of course, being a good social scientist, he's not going to be content with generalizations. He has to be specific. He wants empiric, you want hardcore empirical comments here. So he breaks down the various races. Let's begin with the Irish. The Irish, he says, are not only good after-dinner speakers, but, quote, they give us good salesmen and successful traveling men. Close quote. Unfortunately, however, they are inflicted, in his words, with slackness, unthrift, and irresponsibility. Germans, he says, although strong, are, quote, too stocky for grace, and their slow reflexes make them poor competitors in sports. Scandinavians, he says, are deficient in what he calls visual imagination. Italians, he says, have a propensity for personal violence. Those are his words. He continues, quote, it is generally agreed that southern Italians lie more easily than northern Europeans. The Sicilian, he says, quote, with those darting eyes and hands, will stab his best friend in a sudden quarrel over a game of cards. Now, Slavs. Slavs, he said, are notorious wife beaters. The most numerous group of the Slavs, among the Slavs, the Poles, he says, are, quote, uncleanly, intemperate, quarrelsome, ignorant, priest-ridden, and hard on women and children, close quote. He says they congregate together in an attempt to preserve, quote, a rancid bit of the old world. And he continues, when a few Poles have come into a neighborhood, the other farmers become restless, sell out, and move away. Soon a parish is organized, church and parish school arise, the public school decays, and Slavdom has a new outpost. Close quote. Now, again, it's not clear where he got his statistics are for all this, but I'm sure he has them. Now, of course, any good progressive racial theorist could not avoid Jews. I mean, that's his kind of the climax of all this. Jews, he said, quote, avoid hard muscular labor and prefer instead to supervise, speculate, and finance. Quote, none can beat the Hebrew at a bargain, for through all the intricacies of commerce he can scent his profit. Close quote. Eastern European Jews, he said, tend to pursue Gentile women. They have a bad reputation for lying, and, quote, this is how he ends the article, the insurance companies scan a Jewish fire risk more closely than any other. Now, I mean, you would really think he's doing a satire here, right? But he's not. He is serious. And what is spooky about this period in American history is that people read this and didn't think anything was wrong with it. I mean, see, that's what is spooky. You can always have one crank that can write stuff like this. But in a major magazine, and have people read it and say, yeah, sure. You see how the mentality, now it's that kind of intangible thing that you can't really put your finger on, the spirit. Compare this to what we quoted from Jefferson's time, about the smugglers and the tax resistors and the praises to liberty and the right of resistance. Compare that sort of mental picture, so to speak, with this and the type of mentality that has now arisen in America, not among everyone, obviously, but among enough people that it's become socially respectable. There's a sense in which this is even repulsive by the standards of the slavery arguments. There was a certain, elegance to the pro-slavery arguments. There's a certain respect for logical argumentation. This is just racial smears. Even the early racial theorists who were writing in defense of slavery put up some kind of pretense of argument. There's a great degeneration here, not only in the ideas, but in the whole manner of arguing. Something is happening to the American mind during this period, let me put it that way, and it's a very, very spooky thing. Now, the progressive era, as I said, which is often dated from around 1890 to 1915, I think other speakers will be dealing with it in other facets, and I really don't want to step into their territory, but I want to give you one last example, more or less, of the implications this had for their view of the destiny of America in regard to other nations. I've been speaking more about the worldview they had in terms of domestic policy, but let me give some examples of how they saw things like manifest destiny. Now, I believe Ralph will be going into he'll probably have some comments on the Spanish-American War, but after the Spanish-American War, there's the annexation of the Philippines. And one of the great progressive senators, a rather well-known one, Senator Albert Beveridge, stood up on the floor of the Congress on January 9th, 1900, and defended the annexation of the Philippines in these words. Now, this, again, is not some crackpot senator, well-known guy, wrote quite a few things. He said, "The times call for candor. The Philippines are ours forever, country belonging to the United States, as the Constitution calls them, and just beyond the Philippines are China's unlimited markets. We will not retreat from either. We will not repudiate our duty in the archipelago. We will not abandon one opportunity in the Orient. We will not renounce our part in the mission of our race." Now, you notice the pietistic Whig ideas coming out. "Our part in the mission of our race, trustee under God of the civilization of the world. And we will move forward to our work, not howling out our regrets like slaves whipped to their burdens, but with gratitude for a task worthy of our strength and thanksgiving to Almighty God that He has marked us as His chosen people to lead in the regeneration of the world." Close quote. At this point, Beveridge held up a lump of gold in his hand, declaring it was found on the banks of a Philippine creek. He said, "It must be our great objective to establish the supremacy of the American race throughout the Pacific and throughout the East to the end of time." What about self-government for other nations? It was out of the question, he said, quote, "God has made us the master organizers of this world to establish a system where chaos reigns. He has given us the spirit of progress to overwhelm the forces of reaction throughout the world. He has made us adept in government that we may administer government amongst savage and senile peoples. And of all of our race, He has marked the American people as a chosen nation to finally lead in the regeneration of the world. This," he said, "is the divine mission of America," continuing the quote, "We are the trustees of the world's progress, guardians of its righteous peace. The judgment of the Master is upon us. Ye have been faithful over few things. I will make you ruler over many things." Now, it's a very popular sentiment among these progressives. Again, do you understand what I'm saying? It's not just the ideology. It's this hard-nosed arrogance, dangerous ideas, but mixed with this idea of regenerating the world. Now it's not just America. The pietistic Whigs have turned into the progressive movement, and now it's the world. The world, so to speak, is their oyster. One last example of this sort of thing. This is a quote from William Allen White in his Gazette, March 20th, 1899. He said, and this is again typical progressive rhetoric, this is regarding the self-government of Cuba, which the Platt Amendment required. "Only Anglo-Saxons can govern themselves. The Cubans are not, and of right ought not to be, free. To say that they are or that they should be is folly. It is the Anglo-Saxon's manifest destiny to go forth in the world as a world conqueror. He will take possession of all the islands of the sea. He will exterminate the peoples he cannot subjugate. That is what fate holds for the chosen people. It is so written." Now this sounds like fascism, doesn't it? I mean, really. And it's not coincidental that many of these progressives admired Mussolini in his early years. They admired what they called the corporate state, which they saw Mussolini constructing, a corporate state being a state that's very hierarchically structured with a master plan, so to speak. They did become admirers of fascism, many of them, and they had a problem with war. Now, some of these people, despite the hopped-up rhetoric, were not that crazy about killing people. I mean, the mass murders involved in war bothered them. But what they liked about wartime, the socialists in Britain had the same problem. During the First World War, they noticed that one thing good happened during the First World War, and during the Civil War for that matter. What was it? It was the regimentation of American society and the takeover of many businesses by the government. Power became centralized, the private sector diminished in favor of the state sector. Now, they liked this about war, because about what happened during the wars. Because why did that happen? It happened because all individual goals were subordinated to the great goal of winning the war. In other words, here we have all of our little individual goals down here. Their idea was that there be constant clashing between these individual goals. But if there's an overarching, so to speak, goal up here to which all must submit, then we get the unity, we get the social order that is so ardently desired. This is not a spontaneous order theory, obviously. This is a theory of imposed order by subordinating individual diverse goals to a common goal. All right, so how do you get the effect of this without actual war? How do you do it? Have you ever heard the phrase, the moral equivalent of war? This was from the famous psychologist and philosopher William James, one of the best known of the progressive thinkers. And if you impose upon a nation an overarching goal and demand that everyone subordinate his individual inclinations to that goal, then you will get this sort of pietistic Whig and later progressivist order that you want, this kind of keep in line. We want you orderly, we want you respectful, we want you virtuous. That is the meaning of the moral equivalent of war. Bringing it to more modern periods, whenever you hear phrases like a war on poverty, a war on drugs, a war on ignorance, a war on this, a war on that, whether or not the politicians today are smart enough to have ever read anything beyond newspaper, the point is that is the tradition of that phrase, the war on this, the war on that. What does that imply when you say the war on drugs? It implies that this is such a horrendous social problem that all our resources have to be marshaled in common to fight it. How do you marshal resources? You raise taxes. What does money represent? Money represents, in the real world, in actual life, the right of individual choice. You exercise your choice with other people through the medium of exchange known as money. To the extent that you control that resource yourself, you have a diverse society. You can purchase whatever you wish. To the extent that the government taxes or inflates or gets money from you in some other way, the government controls. So whenever you hear as I think it was Goebbels who was supposed to have said, whenever I hear the word culture, I reach for my revolver. Well, we might say, not that he's someone I would like to quote, but we might say whenever we hear the word a war on, we should reach for our equivalent of whatever it is a libertarian revolver might be. It's one of those phrases you should be kind of reel back at whenever you hear it. The implications are rather ominous, to say the least. Okay. And I want to say a few last things. Let me say first of all, that there's another wing to this, and this is covered very well in Roy Child's article, Big Business and the Rise of American Statism. I'm not going to deal with it at length, partially because it's already in that article, and would just be taking up time with something you already have. The historian who's done the most work on this, or the earlier work, was Gabriel Kolko, actually a Marxist historian, interestingly enough. There have been many other so-called revisionists in this area. You've all heard the story that the one thing the progressive movement did was it was a trust buster. You know, the great Teddy Roosevelt stood up and busted the trust, and they were getting big business to snap in line, pass the Antitrust Act, and so forth. Kolko suggests in his historical work that there was much more involved in some kind of attempt to wanting to, for humanitarian reasons, put the brake on big business. He showed, for example, that before all of this trust busting, the competition was not decreasing in America, but was actually increasing. He proved empirically, more or less, or showed empirically, that even what economic theory would teach us, that in the free market you cannot establish and maintain monopolies. As long as there's no barrier to entrance into the market, it's simply impossible to keep competitors from coming in. And that, in fact, was what was happening. Attempts to fix prices failed. Attempts of cartelization failed. They failed because there was essentially a free market. There was freedom of entry. You couldn't enforce price fixing. People would cheat behind your back, your competitors. All these forces of the market kept these monopolizing tendencies from taking hold. As Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, it was very, very suspicious of what he called the merchant class. You know, it's very rare that two merchants will meet together that they don't conspire in some way against the public good, meaning conspire to fix prices or to monopolize. And Smith was in favor of the free market because for him it was a check on the rapaciousness of those who would want to use the government as a means of acquiring special privilege. That's really the whole point of the free market argument in The Wealth of Nations. It's not a defense of capitalists, of businessmen. It's a way of keeping them honest. He doesn't say businessmen are worse than anyone else. He's not anti-businessman in that sense. He's simply saying it's kind of a natural propensity of human nature, when you can, to take advantage of what's open to you. And if the government's there with special privileges, to the extent you can get control of the government, people will tend to use those special privileges in the form of monopoly grants, in the form of tariffs to exclude competition, and so forth. Now, what Kolko shows is that empirically, in fact, there was increasing trends towards competition, even in the age of the great so-called trusts. What he goes on to argue is that the real motive for much of this trust busting, so-called, and the agencies that were set up, the regulatory agencies during the progressive era, basically they were proposed by certain large businesses as a means of controlling the market. That they served the ends of monopolization by excluding competition. There was not some kind of humanitarian motive involved. Now, if you've read Roy's article or if you read it, you'll find that argued there. This is a pretty complex issue, and I don't pretend to, I really don't mean to generalize and say this is true in every instance. I mean, there's arguments among historians as to what extent this thesis is true. Certainly it's true in many cases, we know that. And it's no surprise today, I mean, I'm sure it wouldn't surprise you if I told you that as much as Ayn Rand might admire businessmen, there are a few businessmen here and there that are not above going to the government and asking for special favors. That happens, right? It happens pretty often. And what Kolko suggests is basically the same thing was happening in the 19th century. People were not much different in that sense then than they are now. Now, so when you look at the progressive era, in my view at least, you should look at it simply as an extension of a certain strain, Hamiltonian strain, which becomes infused with this kind of evangelical zeal, certain pietistic zeal. So you have all the programs in place. You have the call for big government, energetic government, central government, national banking, high tariffs. But you have it combined now with all kinds of laws calling for the prohibition of alcohol, prohibition of drugs, all this stuff emerging in the early 1900s in America. So it's the worst of two worlds. You get the worst on the economic side, and you get the worst on the civil liberties side. You have a number of these progressives calling for compulsory sterilization laws of the mentally unfit. In fact, a number of those laws were passed in the states. It's a very ugly period in American history. I don't know about now, but when I was in high school, the progressives were painted as great humanitarians. They cared about people. I mean, you know, I don't know what they teach now in high school exactly, but that was the picture I was told. I was taught. That was more or less the standard picture of the progressives. They cared. They wanted to get rid of big business and how it exploited the common man. This is really a bunch of nonsense. Another thing you should understand about the progressives, they admired the great trusts. They admired the monopolies or quasi-monopolies that have been established. They admired their organization and their efficiency. And what they tried to do was simply adapt that sort of model to government. They said, look, here's U.S. Steel. Look how efficient it is. Boy, if the government could be like that, it'd be great. If society as a whole could be like that, it would be great. So rather than disliking the trust, so to speak, or that large corporation model, what they did was admire the model and say, but the central government should control it, not individual businesses. And they really tried to adapt that corporate model to specifically society as a whole in America. The premier philosopher of this school, and this is the person I'll end on. Unfortunately, we start on a good note and end on a bad one. This is John Dewey. Now, surely most of you have heard of John Dewey, the premier progressivist theorist who really lived beyond his day. Progressivism had more or less died out by the time when he was still alive. But Dewey, if you read Dewey, it's fascinating because he sums up all the elements I've been talking about in this progressivist ideology. He has that social planning mania combined with his evangelical pietistic zeal. And I'm just going to give you a few brief examples to illustrate the point. Dewey's model, first of all, in a very interesting book called Individualism, Old and New, a book you should read if you're in social or political philosophy, Dewey argues that the old individualism, which he said was motivated by pecuniary profit, and which he called the chief obstacle to the creation of a type of individual whose pattern of thought and desire is enduringly marked by consensus with others, those are his words, this type of individualism, he said, is dying or dead in America. And in its place, we have the new individualism. Now, did you get that passage? He's talking about the old individualism. What's wrong with it? He says it's the chief obstacle to the creation of a type of individual whose pattern of thought and desire is enduringly marked by consensus with others. In other words, if we have the old individualism, we're never going to get a universal consensus in America. How is this new individual, what he calls corporate individualism, how is it to be implemented? Well, he says, look, science has mastered technology. Science has mastered nature. And now science must master society. We need to apply the same kind of social engineering and expert technology to society that we've previously applied to the physical sciences. In short, Dewey's model of a society, summing up the whole corporate view, is a society planned by social experts employing the scientific method. It's therefore no surprise, or it shouldn't be any surprise, that Dewey was a great admirer of the public school system in the Soviet Union. He didn't like certain aspects of it, what was taught. It was rather like Aristotle admiring the Spartan system. He didn't like certain aspects of the content, but he liked the idea of it. He said, we are sure that the future historian of our times will admire those who had the imagination first to see that the resources of technology might be directed by organized planning to serve chosen ends. Close quote. That is his praise of the Russian school system. He says, indeed, in his words, the Russian educational situation is enough to convert one to the idea that only in a society based upon the cooperative principle can the ideals of educational reformers be adequately carried into operation. Now, remember what I said about war and their fascination with war and the kind of corporate society that war created. Dewey was fascinated with what happened in World War I. He said, and I quote, and again I'm quoting these not because I want to inundate you with a lot of direct quotes. Frankly, even now I'm not sure you would believe me that these people were as blunt as they are unless I read it to you from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I'm not reading between the lines here. Concerning World War I, he said, war has revealed the possibilities of intelligent administration. Very significant. Now listen to this. War has revealed the possibilities of intelligent administration. How so? Because of the central planning and nationalization of industry and business and the free market. Now, remember I said that this is not just sort of a scientific planning mentality, it's also the evangelical zeal mentality. Well, let me show you the evangelical side here to close on the progressive era. He says, there's only one way out of the existing educational confusion and drift, That way is a definite substitution of a social purpose, controlling methods of teaching and discipline, and materials for study for the traditional individualistic aim. He went on in a thing called My Pedagogic Creed to say, now here's where the evangelical pietism comes in, I believe that, he has this in capital letters, I believe that, and here is his creed. The teacher is engaged not simply in the training of individuals, but in the formation of proper social life. Every teacher should realize the dignity of his calling, that he is a social servant sent apart for the maintenance of proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. In this way, the teacher always, get the language, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. Now, Dewey is virtually an atheist or an agnostic, just like Mann was a Unitarian. But note the Calvinistic language, the evangelical language. The teacher is the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. What is the true God and the true kingdom of God? Well, the true God is some kind of common good, corporate good. The true kingdom of God is this planned, rigorously enforced social order or corporate order as Dewey envisioned it. So, you couldn't ask for a clear statement summing up. Now, Dewey comes fairly late in this whole philosophy, and as I said, he really kind of outlived his usefulness because the progressive ideology, particularly the support of the fascists in the early stages, didn't win them a lot of friends by other liberals. But the thing I want to point out here, I really to close this up, is that we started off with a quotation from John Adams where he talks about the power of ideas in the American Revolution. That in the course of 15 years, Americans had gone over from one point of view regarding the British to another point of view, and that was the true American Revolution. It was a revolution in ideas. I suggested that particularly with the onset of the Civil War, there was a counter-revolution. I mean, you can kind of trace it back to the Constitution, but I mean, a severe turning around occurs, a counter-revolution occurs with the Civil War. The logical implications of that whole pietistic Whig nationalistic way of thinking trace themselves through the progressive era and are largely with us still. Now, this points out several things. First of all, it points out that ideas do matter. They are important, and it's a cliche, but it's true. They do have consequences. These people are very explicit about what they wanted, and they set out to get it, and they got a good deal of what they wanted. These were idealists in the best sense of the term. They were principled reformers. I think they were not only wrong, but in many cases evil, but they knew what they were about, and they had clear, definite ideology. This was not just the state school system did not just happen accidentally. What we have in America today did not just happen. It happened as a result of individuals pursuing ideals, in many cases sharing the ideals of some of the people I've mentioned. But there's another problem, and this one deals with institutions, the institution of government. You might say that the seeds of the decline of liberty in America were planted at its inception with the establishment of the federal government. The government, the state, in the classical liberal view, is kind of a neutral instrument in a sense. That is to say, you can use it for good purposes or evil purposes. But the point is, political power is a scarce resource. Not everyone can boss everyone else around. There have to be the bossers and the bossees, so to speak, right? Not everyone can control government. Government is a scarce resource. It means that there will be competition in order to control the reins of government, and those in government will tend to want to use the government to put their own values into place, right? Okay. Now, that suggests a lot in terms of explanation for what was happening, say, during the Civil War. In their own ways, the politicians of the North and the South were trying to use the state for their own purposes. The Northerners, many of them, were using it to try to push through high tariffs, high taxation, the whole Hamiltonian financial scheme. Some of the Southerners were using, on the other hand, to keep millions of people in bondage and in slavery. Both were trying to keep a hold of the federal government, not everyone here, of course, but many of them were keeping a hold of the federal government, were fighting it out on the levels of high political power in order to keep their own values in place and to try to win them over through the power of the state. It points out what a dangerous instrument the state is, even if it's not, because it will attract those who most want to use it. It's kind of why the worst get to the top, as F.A. Hayek calls it. So and I think what this points to is that with this competition for control of the state, there's a natural tendency for the state to grow. Libertarians will often say, well, the state will grow and there's no way to stop it. Well, if that's true, the reason is, I think, because there's a constant competition to gain control of it. And as each new person gets in or each new group gets in, they want to push its parameters out a bit further. They want a bit more power. And the institution keeps growing and growing and growing. Doesn't mean it's irreversible, but I think that explains a lot about the institutional problems of the growth of government. And I think history illustrates that extremely well. Now, we begin with John Adams about the power of ideas. John Adams is not one of my favorite people. Let's close with a quotation from Thomas Paine, a person I like a lot better. The thing that's remarkable about this is that these individuals, the Thomas Paine types, went through a lot of very severe hardship in their lives. Thomas Paine came from a lower class background, came to America in his 40s, wrote Common Sense, became very popular, traveled later to England, then to France, was almost killed, lost his head in the French Revolution. He was in prison. Washington, he was convinced, would not let him out, would not get him out of the French prison. He wrote a vindictive attack on George Washington, claiming he was a lousy general. One of the great attacks on George Washington was written by Thomas Paine. Anyway, he had a lot of hardships in his life, and yet, despite all the hardships he went through, he never lost confidence in the power of ideas. This is what was remarkable about these people. Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, even John Adams, curmudgeonly John Adams, Federalist John Adams, they all retained this confidence that ideas matter, that you can change things. So given all that Paine went through, look how he writes towards the end of his life. Does he become bitter? Does he become cynical? No. This is the sort of thing he writes towards the end of his life with all the disappointment and bitterness that he experienced. He wrote, "An army of principles will penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. It will succeed where diplomatic management would fail. It is neither the Rhine, the Channel, nor the ocean that can arrest its progress. It will march on the horizon of the world, and it will conquer." Now, I suppose the moral of this, me talking in the beginning about the revolution being an intellectual revolution and then a counter-revolution, is that, in effect, I suppose many of us here are interested in another revolution, another American revolution. Not a violent revolution, but the same kind of revolution of ideas that John Adams talked about. And although history has many cases that might cause us to be a bit pessimistic, it also has cases that lead us to be optimistic. Because if the right ideas are put in the right way, then there's no reason why the same sort of revolution that John Adams talked about couldn't take place again at some time in the future. Okay, thank you very much. Time for some questions since we didn't have time last time. Yes?
How would you respond to someone who says that things like governments, political parties, and school systems are themselves arise out of spontaneous work?
I think that's just false. I know the argument you're referring to, that everything is a spontaneous order of some kind. But what I mean by spontaneous order is an unplanned organization or interaction. Things like the public school systems were not unplanned. People sat down and said, let's do X, Y, and Z. Let's coordinate our activities, and more importantly, let's impose those choices through the mechanism of the state, by taxation for revenue, by compulsory attendance laws. When you apply force like that, that is not spontaneous order. Or it's using the term spontaneous order in such a way so as to be virtually unrecognizable. Yes?
Going back to the lecture right before lunch, I'd like to know if the written Constitution is a sine qua non to rule by law. And I'm thinking in particular of England, which does not enshrine its rights and freedoms in a written Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of
Well, that's an interesting point because it was debated at the time, as you probably know, in the 18th century about the importance of a written constitution. Jefferson and others believed it was important to have it in writing, but they didn't like the Constitution. They wanted basically a Bill of Rights in writing. They wanted it in black and white, what the government could not do. That was important to them. In that sense, I personally don't believe whether it's in writing or not necessarily makes a lot of difference. The courts, if anything, it might even open up more latitude for the courts to exercise judicial control over interpretation, depending on the wording. I'm not an expert in this field by any means, but there's something that might be said for the common law tradition where you're dealing with precedent, where you don't have a written constitution, that might tend to develop a system of liberty or preserve it longer. Thomas Paine had a very interesting remark when it was said that the British Constitution, or in this meaning here the structure of the British government, was responsible for the freedom of the English people. He denied that even that was true. He said, it is wholly owing to the Constitution of the people of England and not to the Constitution of the government that the people in England are freer than in other countries. Now, he made an interesting point, which I tend to agree with. It has to do with this issue of spirit. Remember those quotations I gave before? That type of spirit? Paine's point was it depends on the spirit of the people. These people generally assumed that a government would go as far as the people would let it. They agreed that if a government, the eternal vigilance idea, If you let a government set a precedent, and then it will eventually go beyond it. This is why the Boston Tea Party was so significant. The argument was, if we let them get away with it once, it's a wedge in the door, their foot is in the door, and it will escalate. And they believe very firmly, and this is very explicit in the literature, that precedents have to be stopped immediately. You let them, if they do it once, you stop it, you resist. You don't let it go on, because the precedent will become established in law. So they tended to focus, and I think I agree with them on this, that the issue is not really one of written versus unwritten constitution. The issue is one of the constitution of the people, as Paine put it, the character of the people, and the extent to which people will simply not allow government to do certain things. And that's kind of an amorphous idea, I realize, but it's that what would we call it? Character, national spirit, whatever. Yes?
What do you see as having been the influence? Because socialism, the socialist idea was growing since about 1820, at least. It certainly had its influence in America.
Yes.
How do you see the socialist influence as part of this movement that you described?
I don't think it was very important, not the real hardcore socialism. You always had minor socialist parties. Now it's becoming increasingly important. It's a lot of, it's important in England, it's important on the continent. The variety of collectivism in America is not really socialism. It's more this corporate welfare statism, which is much closer to fascism than it is to classical socialism. There have been socialist movements in America since the early 1800s. But their impact on American life and American thinking has been rather limited, at least through the era that I'm talking about, through the progressive era. And the thing we're dealing with, and I think quite right, Ayn Rand, for example, in one of her essays, was quite right in pointing out that we're dealing with a kind of fascism. And I don't mean that just as a derogatory term. Fascism has a particular meaning where there's this ostensible private ownership. In other words, the means of production are not collectivized, they're not owned by the state. But there's ostensible private ownership, but with dictation by the state. So it may not seem like an important distinction, but that's what we generally mean by fascism. And that is what has more or less developed in America, this corporate ideology. So I would say that, to my knowledge, through the progressive era, its influence, although it did have influence obviously, was rather minimal compared to this pietistic Whig corporate state ideology. Yes?
One thing that you said before you were a little bit clear about it, that the Irish instituted a private school to finance the public school system and what the children would be indoctrinated with. Were they allowed to have private schools?
Well, there was a big fight about that, and there was even going into the 20th century in this Pierce versus Society of Sisters case. I forget which state that was from. There was a big move by the Ku Klux Klan moving into northern states to make it mandatory to go to public schools. You couldn't even have private schools. The Supreme Court fortunately found that unconstitutional when some state passed that law. There was a fight. Yes, there definitely. Horace Mann, for example, was against any private schools. He didn't want any private school systems. He wanted a perfectly uniform system of common schools. That's what the term common school means. But they were not successful in that fight. Attendance was compulsory, but you always had the option to go to some other accredited school. Beg your pardon? It was. Well, they've tried under various pretexts to close them down, in the same way that they try to close fundamentalist schools down today under various pretexts. Okay.
Everything that you said is true, and they look down on the Irish students in 1840. And they look down upon them too much. Why didn't they just, set quota systems to prevent them?
Well, they tried. They were pushing for immigration restrictions and such. They just weren't successful at it. I don't know the whole political story of the push for immigration laws. Well, America had virtually no immigration laws in those days, and apparently there wasn't much of a movement for them. I mean, America was still a very vastly unsettled country, and there was considered to be enough room for everyone. And they valued, in a sense, the labor that the Irish would do. This is another point we should keep in mind. The Irish would do work that even slaves wouldn't do. Some slave owners would hire Irish to come in and do dangerous labor because the capital invested in slaves. Thomas Sowell points this out, the historian economist who deals with the history of slavery. They would hire Irish to do a lot of the dangerous work because the money they invested in slaves they didn't want to risk, and the Irish would work so cheaply. So the issue of cheap labor probably should be kept in mind. That probably was a good economic incentive. But it was common to see in the streets of Boston and New York and such signs, things like no dogs or Irish allowed. I mean, that sort of sign, was quite common. The prejudice against the Irish was extremely severe. Yes?
How do you think slavery would have ended in the Civil War?
Well, okay, that's a very complex subject. I don't know. One school of thought, as I'm sure you're aware, is that slavery being economically inefficient would have died of its own accord. That was the philosophy behind the Free Soil Party, that if you restrict it and don't allow it to expand, it will die of its own accord. But that had as much to do with the idea of soil exhaustion and other farming or agricultural problems as it did the idea of economic inefficiency. The reason I'm skeptical, now I know a lot of modern economists argue that, the reason I'm skeptical is that when you're wealthy, as a lot of these southern plantation owners were, slaveholding was not just an economic, in the narrow sense, meaning here pecuniary. Slavery was not just a matter of economic efficiency. It was a matter of status. The number of slaves you own determined your status in a southern plantation society. People looked up to you according to the number of slaves you owned. It was a matter of self-esteem, so to speak, a mark of success. It's like saying a Cadillac is economically inefficient because it's a gas guzzler. Well, it's also a sign of prestige. Now, I suppose a good economist would say, well, we'll factor all that in, and the market will somehow take care of it. But I'm skeptical. It would have taken, I think, a long time probably for that ideal to die out. It might have. I frankly think in terms of policies, the policy of Garrison for the North to secede from the South and at least provide a haven for escaped slaves, and also the fomenting of slave insurrections, those policies might have been to a great extent successful. Yes?
I was wondering whether you were against the idea of federalism itself or only against the federalists and their behavior.
What is it you mean by federalism?
Well, the idea, for example, of having a relationship in the structure of government of a whole region or country,
yes.
A relationship of part to part, not part to the whole. In other words, separation of power
yes.
in its most widespread meaning.
Well, see, there's an historical problem here. The Federalists were very astute in labeling themselves Federalists. I'm talking now not about the party, but during the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalists claimed, they called themselves Federalists, and they called their opponents Anti-Federalists, the opponents of the Constitution. The opponents replied that the opponents, were the real Federalists, because Federalists imply some sort of relationship between sovereign states, and the theory of the Constitution, the debate over it, was whether sovereign states had entered into it or whether it was some sort of union. Federalism, in the sense in which it was meant then by these Jeffersonians, as a political structure, is preferable to the idea of an indissoluble union. Federalism today means something different, though. Let me just say that my attitude toward federalism would be reflected in my attitude toward government. I have a hard time choosing between forms of government when my attitude toward government itself is so dismal. I happen to think, frankly, that although some forms of government may be somewhat better in checking the growth and abuses of government, nothing will check it in the structure of government itself. As Madison, I talked earlier about Madison saying the real problem is not the problem of checks and balances between the branches of government, it's the problem of keeping these branches from going out into the public sphere. This is the father of the Constitution saying this, saying the checks and balances is basically a farce. That the judiciary won't encroach upon the legislative branch. That's not the real problem. The problem is from keeping all these branches from going out and gobbling up more of the private sector. And how do you check that? Jefferson's answer was to keep up the spirit of resistance and rebellion. And that's why you get this whole emphasis on eternal vigilance. So I'd say, no matter what form of government you have, I don't have an opinion of federalism in that sense one way or the other. No matter what form you have, you're going to have to keep up that sort of vigilance. Yeah.
I was wondering, are there any textbooks that are written for the junior high, the high school, or the college level that have described history in the way that you detailed it today?
Not exactly, no. You have to get it from here and there. I mean, they're individual books. I don't know about the high school level. Or below, frankly. The Arthur Eckertz book, Decline of American Liberalism, has a good many of these components in it. It's not quite as radical in its orientation, but certainly it has. Was that distributed as part of this conference? You can get a good many of my interpretation of progressivism is a bit different than his, but certainly the militarism and imperialism, and Eckertz is a libertarian. So you'll get a libertarian perspective in that book. So that's basically our only one-volume book of that nature that I know of. That's about it, unless there's been a volume written that I'm not aware of that covers all this. Does anyone know of one, by the way, before we go into other questions? Is there any suggestion here, in case I'm missing something? Okay, over here one day.
I just wanted the slave question that was brought up here. There's two books that anybody interested in might pursue on that point. One of them is Roll, Jordan, Roll by Eugene Genovese, who's a Marxist. And the other one is Time on the Cross by Vogel and Ingerman, who are economic historians. Interestingly, both coming from very different schools of thought. Vogel and Ingerman especially conclude that slavery was very economically efficient, was probably becoming more efficient. and any hope based on it dying out because of inefficiency was doomed to failure. Genovese used slavery as a model for all kinds of paternalism, compared it to some of the modern Japanese state, at least pre-World War II, and some of which I'm sure we've been touching on here. And for that different reasons, from a Marxist perspective, I think it's especially interesting, also concluded it was stable. I don't recall it in so many words, but it would have taken some external force to upset it. It would not have died its own.
Yeah, I have a problem with the Time on the Cross book in a different respect. In the picture it paints of slavery, it's supposed to be a corrective. It went into the slave records and said that a lot of the claims made about slavery were not true, families being split up and this sort of thing. I mean, it almost makes it sound like, I mean, well, let's put it this way. I didn't see a lot of free blacks in the North running down to the slave system and wanting to join up. I mean, that's almost the impression you get from that book sometimes, is if it wasn't all that bad, then how come they weren't running from the northern factories? That was kind of the Southern apology for slavery, was that the slave laborers were actually economically better off than were the free black laborers in the North. And that became a major counter-argument by the slaveholders. George Fitzhugh wrote a very famous book where he argued, in effect, that the capitalists in the North were exploiting the blacks far more than the slave owners in the South. And yet, which way did they run? Which way did their feet carry them?
Just an economic point.
As I know, I agree with your point. I understand, but as you mentioned that book, and I thought I'd make that comment on, but it doesn't relate to the point you made. The point you made, I tend to agree with, as far as I know. Yeah.
Two questions. First, Mr. Rothbard mentions before New Liberty that the state of Oregon passed legislation, I think it became a law that called for the immediate abolishment of all private schools.
That was that Pierce versus Society of Sisters. That was the Oregon case. Yeah, that's about.
Other state legislatures have passed legislation along those lines.
I believe there were efforts, but after the Supreme Court reversal of that, it was stopped. But that was the Ku Klux Klan was behind that case in Oregon quite a bit. White and kind of Protestant supremacist groups were behind it. You want to say something else, sir?
Yeah, I'm interested in your views about what should be done about education now. Do you favor abolishing government-owned schools? Are you sympathetic to Milton Friedman's ideas about a voucher system?
I'm not sympathetic to vouchers because in many cases it increases the control of government over even private schools that are at present private, and then you then have to pass even more certification or whatever to be able to get the vouchers in the first place. Tax credits, where you actually keep the money, would be the best way to go. And frankly, I think the real heroes in this are the evangelicals who are setting up their own private schools and thumbing their nose at the government. I frankly think that this will not be solved on a legal ground. There's just too much vested interest. The NEA, if you combine it with the other major teaching in the United States, constitutes probably the largest organized labor force in the United States, with extremely strong vested interests. And they scream bloody murder whenever these vouchers and tax credit proposals come up. And I think what's going to happen is you're going to have some people going to jail, like it's already happened with some of these evangelical minister types who set up their own schools and say, we've got a right to teach our kids the way we want to teach them, and, buzz off. And they drag them off to jail. They put them in chains and close up their churches. I'm not happy to see that, but unfortunately that's the way social change often takes place. Somebody puts their neck on the line at some point in time, there becomes a public awareness of the injustice of it, and then things start to change. I don't think it will change peaceably in the sense of totally through court decisions. There's too much vested interest. And until the television cameras are rolling and we see parents being separated from their children, and until we see certain teachers, perhaps ministers, being dragged off to prison because they just want to teach, and that people get outraged, until we see that sort of thing, I personally don't expect to see a lot of fundamental change. And it's going to take a long time, by the way. It's not a process that's going to happen quickly. So I must say that I greatly admire what the evangelicals have done in this area, even though I personally obviously have major philosophical disagreements with what they're teaching. I think it's great. I mean, I think competition in that sense is wonderful in education. Yeah.
Just some general comments, if I may. I think without being facetious, you could well subtitle your lecture "Decline of Ideological Purity."
How about the decline of liberty?
Well, the reason I phrase it that way is that it isn't really sufficient to identify a collection of good ideas. The process of propagating them has not been fully identified. In fact, the analogies, I had no idea that there were such significant analogies between American history and European history, for instance. it makes it clear that there are other forces at work other than simply telling somebody, this is a good idea.
I agree, and that's frankly what I was trying to get at, although very briefly, with this point about the institution. That once you set up an institution that's a power institution, then ideas can sound great, but things start to happen on an institutional level. There's a certain order that evolves quite apart from simply teaching ideas or not teaching them. So there are really two facets. There's the realm of ideas, which I again stress, I do think are important, but certainly not the only thing. Let me put it this way. Ideas are a necessary but not sufficient condition for social change. That summarizes it. Someone's had their hand up for a long time. So, yeah.
I just wanted to ask a question in relation to the rise of the progressive era during that time span. I think it was the Democratic Party was so divided under William Jennings Bryan, his platform to try to unite the agrarian interests, and I think trying to return to a pietistic movement as well. I was wondering, can you recall what he was standing for when he made some speech about hanging something at a cross of gold or something like that?
That was the, what was that? Was that the silver issue? Free silver issue, yeah. That was a free silver issue. Bryan was an interesting character. You know, he really, in a sense, was a throwback to a Jeffersonian tradition in certain ways. But he also, you're right, quite right, that he was an infusion of that pietistic. He was a weird combination. Good on some things, horrible on others. And you're quite correct in pointing out that, what was that, 1898 when he ran? Is that the...
Yeah, 96.
Beg your pardon? 96? Yeah, 96. That really did cause a tremendous split in the Democratic Party. And the Republicans ruled the roost for some time after. Yeah.
What do you see as the fundamental philosophical force that provoked this growing collectivism in the 19th century? That you feel it in the literature.
Yeah. I think it was war. I think war does that. I think if you're going to, I mean, this is an oversimplified answer. There are a lot of things, okay? Some historians will say it's industrialization. And I hear this so much, the rise of industrialism and the response to industrialism. How many books are there carry titles of the 19th century America talking about the response to industrialism, the trend to centralization, etc., usually written by left-leaning historians, they say, was an inevitable outcome of the industrialization of American society. Americans found them thrust from a simple agrarian society into a complex industrial world with the technological industrial revolutions, and they needed a sense of order in their lives, and they turned to the central government. I mean, we've all heard this, right? It's a very common theme. Well, there may be some sense in that. But this sort of corporate state building is not some kind of knee-jerk reaction that's inevitable reflex to the complex society created by industrialism. There has to be an ideology behind it. I think far more than any kind of industrialism arising, causing people to be alienated or whatever, is the fact of war. The Civil War in particular, but wars all throughout the 19th century. It's been pointed out through Jonathan Hughes' book, The Governmental Habit. Very important book, if you haven't read it. I have to put it down here. Hughes. Jonathan Hughes, The Governmental Habit, an economic historian, goes through the major wars in American history and points out the drastic growth in governmental power after each war. And what he says, in effect, is that, okay, here you have the growth in government power. A war happens. It goes like this. Expands tremendously. After the war, in many cases, it reverts back, but never back to the original state. Maybe say, I wouldn't know how to quantify it, but say it goes back to here. So your net growth is here. Then it goes on again, a big outburst with another war. If I were to put my finger on the one type of event that has done more to expand the nation state and the governmental power in America, it's war. That includes World War I, World War II, the sort of things Ralph will be discussing. It does it every time. And if you want to see the death of any revival of classical liberalism in America, wait and just, if the United States gets another war, this movement will disintegrate for the most part, or very possibly it will. The World War I killed what little left there was of classical liberalism in England and the United States. It's not only death to liberty, it's death to any movements promoting liberty. Yes. Can I get someone? I only have one or two left, and some people haven't asked any questions. Do you mind? Thank you. Who hasn't asked a question? Yeah.
Something related to that question. Do you think that all those ideas about the superiority of the American race, or the American superiority, were isolated ideas, or?
No, they're very common. Very common.
Very common.
Yeah.
General opinion of the American people.
Oh yes. I mean, in certain segments of it, it's hard to categorize about a whole people. I mean, they were. Let me put it this way: they were characteristic of the kind of pietistic Whig born-again American type of culture. It wasn't characteristic of the German or the Irish or the Scotch immigrants. America is a very heterogeneous society. This type of superiority, this kind of we are the conquering race attitude comes from that, at least in my opinion, comes from that Whig pietism, that we will evangelize and save the human race. We are the chosen of God. And that is something that was embedded at first in the Whig Party, later the Republican Party, and then really comes out with its most obnoxious exponent in Theodore Roosevelt. Okay, well, let's close it here. Thank you very much.